Hi everyone. So what I'm going to be talking about in this video is really an amalgamation of a number of stories, topics that I want to cover. But it makes sense to put them together because it's all linked under the general banner of pan-Islamist extremism in Europe and Britain. Um, there's very similar situations that we see in the UK and other European countries. But I'm going to break it a little bit down because there's some specifics about the UK that I want to talk about. To be honest, any one of these things could have been a video in its own right, but before I was having some technical problems regarding space on my computer and so on, so frustratingly I couldn't upload them at the time. In the last few months we have seen in Sweden Salwan Mamika shot dead. He was a man who was got attention for burning the Quran in Stockholm, and he'd done this publicly. He was shot dead. Now, when this was reported by the BBC and other news sources, there were Muslims, not just Islamists, Muslims actually coming out and condoning it and saying, well, this is what happens when you insult our dear Prophet. And there was a very, very palpable consensus there of condoning the murder. One or two comments were along the lines of, it's unfortunate he died, but, basically it's his own fault. And I was disgusted by that sort of mentality, because there can never be an equivocation between an extreme act of violence, i.e. murdering a man, versus insulting someone with a provocative act. There's just no comparison. And I remember when I posted about this, a Syrian friend of mine, a guy I've known for a while, I wouldn't say he's a close friend, but he's someone I worked with. He's, I like him on a personal basis, but he got quite defensive about this, and he wanted to convince me of how much of a religion of peace Islam was, and he did condemn the murder, to be fair, but he was arguing that I'd got it wrong regarding Islamist extremism. And, he came out with the old tired line about it's got nothing to do with Islam, i.e. extremism. But I directed him to the fact that there were literally Muslims coming out and condoning this. We have to accept the basic reality. Islam has a problem with hypersensitivity, and it has a problem with violence. That's a fact. So I do not believe that, certainly not political Islam, can ever be compatible with Western democracy. And I think Muslims need to be more honest about the problem in their midst. All Muslims. There's a contradiction in this way of thinking, of saying that Islam has nothing to do with violence. It's kind of what I would call an Islamo-supremacist argument, because Islam's a major world religion. There's about, figures vary, but it's about 1.4 to 1.5 to 1.7 billion adherents around the world. It's a major religion, second only to Christianity in the numbers. What I would say to any Muslim who wants to pretend that there aren't extremists in their midst, do you seriously think that among almost 2 billion people there are no extremists who would carry out violence in the name of religion? That's delusional. To me, saying that Islam has nothing to do with Islamist violence is a bit like saying that Crusades had nothing to do with Christianity. It's dishonest. I think it's just because naturally someone who isn't a terrorist, who isn't an extremist, and that they're minding their own business, they're going to their mosque, they're just getting on with life, they don't want to be associated with these fanatics of ISIS and Boko Haram and others, understandably. But it's simply disingenuous to pretend that those people are not brainwashed and radicalized by their interpretation of Islam. It's just dishonest to say that it has nothing to do with Islam. They're not being radicalized in the name of Christianity or Buddhism or Jainism or Sikhism or other religions. It's Islam that they're coming from. That's the reality. So you can say they're not true Muslims, they're misinterpreting the Quran. You could say what you want, but what's to say they won't turn around and say they are the true Muslims? Do not tell me that when jihadist gunmen are literally picking out who is Muslims and who is not Muslims, as happened in the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya some years ago, don't tell me that there isn't a religious agenda there. And this isn't just manifested in terrorism. When a young man is beaten to death in Pakistan for alleged blasphemy, you see people saying, oh, it was wrong what they done. They shouldn't have killed him. He should have been hanged instead. In other words, he should have been judicially executed. That is really striking. Islam, as an ideology, definitely is regressive. Recently, the world's only gay imam was shot dead in South Africa. Anyway, this guy, Salwan Momika, shot dead in Stockholm. In Magdeburg, we had the vehicle attack in December. Now, at the time, there was mixed reports coming out that he was actually an ex-Muslim who had railed against Islam. It now transpires it probably was more likely that he was influenced by Islamist sources. Also in Germany, in Munich recently, there was a vehicle attack, and sadly, that has now claimed 2 victims, a woman and a young child, and many others were injured. This is going to keep happening in Europe. Now, we can't ban cars. That's not realistic. And with the tightest security possible, even if you put bollards up, these fanatics will find some way. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be effort to try and stop it, but the real issue here is the ideology. Now, Germany has an election this week. In a few days, they'll have a new chancellor, most likely Friedrich Merz. I may make a video about the German election specifically. The direction that Germany goes in is entirely up to Germans. And I know that the CDU and other conservative groups don't want to have any connection with the AfD. And I know that there's been big rallies in Germany against the rise of the AfD. Elon Musk, of course, has stuck his nose into it, which I think is just contemptible. It's not up to Elon Musk to tell the German people who they should vote for. But mainstream German politicians do need to consider, why is the AfD getting support? Maybe it's because they are fed up of this sort of Islamist extremism. I think for a long time now, Western Europe has put political correctness above the reality on this. And this is the situation in Germany, it's the situation in the Nordic countries, it's certainly the situation in the UK. France has certainly had its bulk, probably more than most other Western countries in terms of Islamist violence. Macron, to be fair, has been a bit more outspoken than some other Western leaders. But we need to wake up to the reality. Pan-Islamism is a reality. It's out there. And talking about it is not bigotry against Muslims. It infuriates me the way Islamophobia is weaponized to try and silence debate. And I think Starmer's government has some real questions to answer regarding free speech. Now, I just want to make a caveat here. J.D. Vance had the arrogance to stand up and lecture Britain and Europe about free speech. I do actually think there are free speech issues in this country, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I think J.D. Vance is the last person in a position to lecture this country. He is representing an administration that has absolutely railed against any critical media outlets that, given half a chance, would use Elon Musk's money to buy up the American media and effectively have that entirely under the control of MAGA Republicans. So I really don't think they're in a position to lecture about free speech. And that shameful, disgraceful, cowardly sellout at Riyadh of Ukraine, for Trump to pander to Putin the way he did, I really don't think the Trump administration, whether that be Trump or Vance, has any right to lecture Europe when it comes to free speech. They go to the other extreme. I will come to this issue in a second, but I do not believe it's legitimate to say inciting violence is part of free speech. I don't think it is. And the irony about free speech absolutists is, by extension, they would actually have to enable Islamists. Because if you get an Islamist hate preacher railing against, Westerners, infidels, Jewish people, gay people, women, what have you, if They really want to push the absolutist free speech argument. Ironically, the likes of J.D. Vance would fall into the trap of their own argument if they want to be free speech absolutists. I am not a free speech absolutist. I do think that threatening violence is crossing a line. I do think that making false accusations against someone is crossing a line. But where I think it is deeply alarming is when legislation in this country, and this is where I mentioned we have free speech issues. Well, there's a man in Manchester who kind of replicated the Salwan Mamika incident, and he tore pages out of a Quran. He held the Israeli flag. Now, there was controversy around that incident because, in an unusual step, Greater Manchester Police arrested him for a racially aggravated public order offence. They named him on social media. Now, given what happened in Sweden, given that Mr. Momika was killed, that is incredibly reckless of Greater Manchester Police. I don't know what the logic in that was. Maybe they named him to avoid speculation. But there's an important point to note. England and Wales repealed blasphemy laws in 2008. The Humanist UK group has strongly condemned the arrest of this man, and apparently a second man was also arrested. Now, racially aggravated public order offence, where is the racial aggravation there? He's offended a faith group. That's not the same as a race. I mean, does Greater Manchester Police believe that Muslims are a race? This is actually a very important point because it's often conflated. There's white Muslims. Muslims come from all sorts of backgrounds, nationalities. This idea that it's therefore a racially aggravated offence is deeply dubious. I would say a serious abuse of power. Greater Manchester Police have to explain themselves. They need to explain why they're effectively enacting blasphemy laws on the streets of one of our biggest cities. It's a disgrace. Now, just a caveat here. This is not to say that I think burning a holy book is a good idea. I personally wouldn't advocate it. I don't think it's particularly productive. I don't think it's a good thing to do. But if someone's bought a Quran themselves, if it's their own property, i.e. they've bought it, it's their property, they can do what they want with it. If they burn it, that's a provocative act. I don't think it's a particularly sensible thing to do. I don't think it's a particularly productive thing to do, and I don't think it's the best way to tackle Islamic extremism. Although it could be argued that when Islamists then enact violence against these people, they're just proving that they are indeed a violent threat. So I don't know if there could be an argument that by, doing something provocative, it kind of reiterates the point, oh look, they are violent after all. Now, most Muslims aren't going to threaten people who are doing that, but the fact is there is Islamists out there who do, and there are many, many others who condone it. I cannot think of a comparable situation in Christianity. I mean, I remember when the Da Vinci Code was made, there was some controversies around that because it obviously went away from Scripture. And there was some complaints from the church at the time, but it was kind of muted. As far as I recall, people could correct me if I'm wrong about this, but Dan Brown, Ron Howard, Tom Hanks, none of them got death threats because they were, in a movie that was, in fact, Lincoln Cathedral, I believe, was used for part of that film. So you even had a Christian cathedral allowing itself to be used in a film that was veering away from Scripture. You just don't see this sort of sensitivity in the same way. Consider those sort of fancy dress parties where you have people dressing up as clergymen and tarts, like a mocking sort of thing. You could not get away with that if it was an imam. I'm not saying people should go out and mock Islam, or any faith for that matter, but there is clearly a hypersensitivity at play there, and pretending otherwise is nonsense. I think it is concerning when we have people arrested for a provocative act, but isn't ostensibly actually breaking any laws. Greater Manchester Police have to explain what laws. They say it's a racially aggravated public order offence. So my challenge to Greater Manchester Police, are you saying Muslims are a race? They seem to be confused about this. And also galling is the fact that you get Islamists on our streets, chanting anti-West slogans, and yet sometimes the police intervene, a lot of the time they don't. They'll sort of give them a gentle warning that will just quieten down a little bit or something, but they won't make arrests. There is absolutely, unquestionably, double standards in policing in this country. And I think it has to be said that when you have someone who is white, a British citizen, and they're making some sort of protest, then the police will swoop in there and make an arrest. And sometimes that's justified if, they're crossing a line in terms of getting really into disorder. But the police cannot say that there isn't double standards going on. I do think there is two-tier policing going on in this country. It's not a far-right conspiracy theory. The evidence is there. Why is it that you get demonstrators shouting literally Allahu Akbar on the streets of Britain and nothing happens to them? Yet someone who does a provocative thing, pulls pages of a Quran out of a Quran is immediately arrested. Maybe the police arrested him for his own safety, but even that is an alarming sign. Now, I've just watched a segment on GB News. I watch it because the woman who posted it is someone I respect. GB News is definitely not my go-to. Nevertheless, it would be a bit petty, I think, to just totally disregard a news source because I don't like the general message. But they did quote something important. Amjad Tahar, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he's a counter-extremism expert. He has said that we actually now arguably have a bigger problem with extremism in the UK than there is in the Middle East. And what's telling is that 8 groups linked to the Muslim Brotherhood in this country have been prescribed as terrorist organisations by the United Arab Emirates. So we now have a situation where Arab countries are actually designating Islamist groups in the UK to be terrorist organisations. And yet they're flourishing in this country. I remember when Lee Anderson made the comments about, he's now a Reform Party MP, when he made the comments about Starmer and Khan being in the pockets of Islamists, he was condemned by many people, but there is something in this. I remember the Tory Robert Jenrick also came under condemnation when he said that demonstrators shouting out Allahu Akbar on our street should be arrested. I think he was absolutely right. It's all very well for imams to say, oh, but this doesn't mean violence. It's just a sort of motivational thing. Yeah, well, it's also been used in Islamist attacks. At the very least, it's insensitive to survivors of terrorist attacks. Because even if they're using that in the context of God is great, it's some sort of motivational chant, as opposed to a call for violence, given that we've had Islamist attacks in this country that have killed and wounded hundreds, if not thousands of people, including the wounded thousands, then it's deeply inappropriate. And the fact that the police basically stand by and watch that whilst they swoop in to arrest someone for, criticising Islam, it's deeply, deeply concerning. The police in this country are doing themselves no favours by pandering to this stuff. Like I say, blasphemy laws were repealed in England and Wales in 2008. Now, I think it's legitimate for Muslims to criticise Quran burning. They can say that's disrespectful to my faith, I don't like it, don't do that. But threatening someone is crossing a line. Okay? This should be a no-brainer. The fact that the police, instead of making any arrests against anyone who would have threatened this man, they decide to arrest him. If there are Islamists out there who have such a loss of self-control that they want to violently murder someone, if you think of the logic of it, there's millions of Qurans in publication. So why get so intensely angry about one book when there's millions more in circulation? It's not like this guy was. It's also says something about the sensitivity of Islam that, is it so hypersensitive that it needs people to protect it because one person decides to be provocative? That's just insane. I remember there was a time when there was a young Christian woman in Pakistan, Aisha Bibi. It was a well-known case. She was looking for refuge in Europe, and at the time, I think she was Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May could not guarantee her safety in this country. And so her application was rejected. We have an Islamist problem in our midst. I think all mosques in this country have to work with the government. They have to work with the likes of Prevent. If they don't want to work with Prevent, why not? For example, expelling Islamists in their midst, kicking them out. I mentioned this guy, Amjad Tahar. He was warning about the extremism threat. They also interviewed Sohail Ahmed, who's a commentator on this issue. He's a former Islamist himself. I always think they're the best people to listen to. They've literally been in that frame of mind. You know, he mentioned the reason he got out of this is he sort of self-reflected and realised what they were doing was absolute hypocrisy. They were exploiting, Islamists are exploiting the freedom that we have in this country, free speech, the freedom of our institutions, and they're absolutely exploiting sensitivity to racism and so-called Islamophobia. We need to wake up. It's been a few years now since the last big Islamist attack in this country, but there's no reason why what happened in Munich and Magdeburg wouldn't happen here. I think hate crime laws need to be seriously scrutinised, and I think that police need to be scrutinised for their double standards. They need to answer questions. Is it their position that someone who offends Islam is guilty of a racially aggravated public order offence? If so, how do they explain that? My question for the police is, do you deem Muslims to be a race, as opposed to a religious group which is diverse within itself? You get white Muslims, black Muslims, Asian Muslims. So the idea of designating that a racially aggravated public order offence is ridiculous. So, I think Vance is the wrong messenger. I don't think we should take any lectures from the American administration right now. But Starmer's government is doing itself no favours either. I want senior ministers to come out unequivocally and say they support free speech. So far, we haven't seen that in any notable way. I am very concerned about how hate crime legislation is used. I personally don't think it's a good idea to desecrate a Quran. I certainly wouldn't do it, but, personal taste is beside the point. There may be comedians I dislike. I don't like the form of comedy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to say they should be silenced and censored. The only caveat I would make is if they're really, really, trying to hurt, say, survivors of some tragedy. And like, say, for example, you had some comedy show on about Grenville. At the base of Grenville, I think that would be not only in bad taste, but I do think that would be deliberately seeking to hurt survivors. But, that's just an example. The point is, if you believe in freedom, then you have to extend that to people that you don't like and don't agree with. That's the basic principle of it. With the caveat that there's no license to act out threats, which is another reason I was so, I really take issue with J.D. Vance, because the people who were jailed in this country actually weren't jailed for having an opinion. They were jailed for making threats, namely encouraging their supporters to burn down buildings with people inside. Now, we can argue about it's unfair that they're jailed, but someone like Hugh Edwards isn't. Okay, there's legitimate arguments around that, but anyone who thinks that inciting violence is harmless is deluded. And ironically, there's a bit of a paradox here in free speech absolutists by extension would be defending Islamists. The Islamists would exploit that. So they need to realise how naive that position is. There is no green light to commit violence by anyone, against anyone. The only situation that's justified is absolute self-defence or defending a more vulnerable person. That's it. But I'm going to wrap this up. But I've said this many, many times on my channel. Pan-Islamism is a reality, and we have to confront it, be honest about it, without this weasel word Islamophobia being thrown around. Too many on the left continue to do that. The Labour Party does it. I've no doubt the Liberal Democrats do it. And there are senior politicians like Lord Ahmed, the Tory peer, who will throw this word around. Anyone who throws this word around needs to be challenged. They need to be asked, do you oppose religious extremism or not? And if the answer is yes, then why is it you're weaponizing this word to silence debate? This isn't to say that there isn't examples of anti-Muslim bigotry or anti-Muslim hate crimes that actually do happen. For example, if someone vandalizes a mosque, or if they violently attack someone who is, for example, an obvious Muslim, like a woman in a hijab or an imam leaving the mosque, if they're physically attacked for being a Muslim, then yeah, that's absolutely wrong. But I do not think that it is an endemic problem in this country. Um, Certainly doesn't justify this kind of catch-all, you better not criticise Islam. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely must be freedom to criticise religion. And that must be differentiated from hating individuals. If someone gets up and says they hate all Muslims, that I could see that being, incitement. But saying they hate Islam, whether you agree with it or not, I think that's legitimate. There has to be freedom to criticise religion, otherwise we're not a democracy. Um, and right now, some of it is being seriously tested. I'll wrap that up, but yeah, let me know your thoughts.